a regenerative landscape where we're really looking at living off the planet in ways that actually can heal the ecosystem's health and then the health of the people that are living in that. So we'll be exploring that process through what I'm calling participatory design, in ways that we can actually intercept, participate, and reshape our future. So we'll start out with what I call the foundation of really our whole current paradigm, which is including our economic system, our social system. And really when you get to the root of it, you can find that we have a really interesting, to say the least, view of nature. And so up there you can see some of our two views of nature. So we can see nature as something that's wild and that needs to be tamed or controlled, or something that's pure that humans need to stay out of, that we don't want to mess up. And so when we think of this as the fundamental core for our political beliefs, and economic and invisible systems belief, we see a really interesting landscape that's created from that. So I've outlined a couple practices that kind of illustrate what that foundational belief can result in. So on the left we can see mountaintop removal, and then clear cutting, and this is really just highly manicured, controlled landscapes. And so, moving on to this next one, we also can see nature as tourism, where we put up fences, you pay a fee, and we get to go visit nature, almost as if we're going to the zoo. And a great teacher, Murray Bookchin, who a lot of this is thought is based on, who co-founded social ecology, which really links social and environmental problems as one and the same. So he says ecological problems are actually social problems. And so what happens when you view nature and society and ourselves as interconnected, is actually part of the same thing? What would that look like if we changed the way that we view nature, instead of competition, survival of the fittest, which we're getting from Darwin and Malthus? We're really trained to think of nature and ourselves as that competition, scarcity. But what if we take a new view of nature and actually look at how, if we held up a yardstick, if you can imagine a yardstick, and the yardstick is all of human time. The way that we've been living with this current paradigm is really only the last, let's say, maybe 500 years, where if we trace back the history of humanity, we actually see a couple things in common. And one of those is the idea of usufruct. And so that is where characteristics like greed and hoarding that are prompted and promoted in our current culture were actually seen as antisocial behavior. And so they had some tools that they would actually share in common. Land was shared in common. And so that, if we look in that huge trajectory, is where most of our collective memory comes from. So this is a more recent phenomenon that we're seeing in the last 500 years. So to think about how this underlying nature philosophy as humans as separate from nature plays out in our social system, we can just throw up a slide that's looking at the income gap. And this was more recently brought to our attention by the Occupy movement. And so if you look at, this is actually the income gap. Over here on the left is the rise during the Great Depression. And if you can see where we are now in the US, we've actually exceeded that gap. So we actually have more income disparity now than we ever did in the Great Depression. And so it brings up an interesting point, and if to go back to some of the thoughts behind social ecology, is that we're almost taught to believe that we are the problem, that humans are the problem. And Murray talks about an interesting exhibit going to a museum in New York, and it was a museum of ecological devastation after devastation, much like the slide I had earlier. And then at the end of the exhibit, there was a huge mirror. So when you got to it and you stepped in front of it, it said, you know, the most terrible creature on earth, and it was a reflection of you. And, you know, to put that out there is really a fallacy, because if we trace where a lot of the ecological destruction is coming from, it's coming from this underlying nature philosophy, where we have an economic system that's really based on growth. And we see the continuation of growth and growth and growth. And if we look at that for a mimic in the natural world, we actually do see it. And where we see it is in cancer. And so when we're reflecting on what we actually do want, how can we have a economic system, environmental system that's actually based on our inherent ability to do good and to regenerate and heal both the social and environmental systems, which are really closely linked. So how can we take this other view of humans and really recognize our ability as what's called a keystone species? So how can humans be that keystone species that's bringing about cleaner water, cleaner air, more equality, more democracy? How can we play that role in the ecosystem as more of a healing role? And to look at that, we can really look towards design as a technique and a set of skills to facilitate that transformation. So this is a great graphic. It's looking at the trajectory of environmentally responsible design. And so we can see on the right here, we've got conventional practice. That maybe that's where we're operating. That it's one step, this is called one step better than breaking the law when we're thinking about EPA regulations, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. And then maybe we've got green. We're starting to integrate some of our green technologies. It's where we're seeing LEEDs and other codes that are a step better. It's maybe a less bad approach. And then we're going into something that's a little more sustainable. But how do we actually bust through that? And how do we create design that's actually restorative? And then going on from restorative, from humans kind of doing things to nature, how do we jump up to humans participating in nature? And how do we see nature as not this static thing, but actually recognize that it's a living system that we can play a part of, and a big part of. And this is where I look to permaculture design. So permaculture design came about in the late 70s. It was first brought about in Australia, where they have a much different climate than we do here. So Australia is a very brittle climate, which means that they have to deal with things like drought and storms much more frequently than we do here. And so in the 1970s, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren figured out a design system that was actually based on nature. They went out and they observed ecological patterns, and they observed people that were living in societies that observed those natural patterns, and they distilled that down into different principles and also a set of ethics. This is Earth Care, People Care, and Fair Share is really a moral compass that is really unique in design. This is a design that has a set of ethics. And when we're doing our design, we can measure it up against this. We can say, how is this doing in ecological sense? How is this doing for people care and people health? And how is this doing for sharing the surplus and economics? And recognizing that we're not looking at an extreme in either end, but we can get a good balance when we're looking at those three things together. And so they developed this design system first in Australia, and it's doing amazing in Australia. It's in all of the grade schools. People are learning that they're a part of nature. They can go about healing it and using these transformative principles and set of ethics to set out and do so. And kind of at the basis of this is Bill kept reading the newspaper, and all he kept seeing was really bad news. And he kept saying, well, I don't want to see bad news. I actually want to be a part of creating a vision of what we do want to see, and using permaculture as really a lens to facilitate that shift. So that really begs the question is how much can design not only influence democracy, ability for self-determination, equality, and regenerating ecological systems, but how can it shift that foundation of our underlying view of nature? Penny Livingston, a teacher of mine, quotes a permaculture principle, which was design like nature. And she says that if you even put that design like nature, you're separating humans from nature. And so she always says, we are nature designing. We are nature working, that we're a part of that system. And if you look into a pattern language, which permaculture goes into detail, and you can look at some of the very patterns that we have on our bodies and look at our handprints and notice that we actually have topo lines. We actually have riverscapes reflected in the patterns on our hands. And we can look at the Fibonacci sequence, which is used all the time in building, as actually being some of the ways that our body's built. Looking at 1 + 1 is 2 and 2 + 1 is 3. So we really see that how closely related our human bodies are to the earth. An interesting fact is if you look at amniotic fluid for children that are in the womb, it's of the same composition as the ocean. So it's really fascinating once you see how real that really is. So then how can we use design as that crowbar to really shift a whole new paradigm and way of viewing the world? And that's what lands us on to participatory design. So participatory design was actually created in Scandinavia in the 1970s. And it was originally created with trade unions, where they were working and instead of going from what the boss thought was great, they actually flipped it. And they said, well, what about if the workers got to have a say in how things were run? And what if we involved them in the redesign of how things worked? And so they developed that in the 1970s, and more recently it's become big here in the US. And so the definition here that I got from Wikipedia is a way of creating environments that are more responsive and appropriate to their inhabitants and users' cultural, emotional, spiritual, and practical needs. So it's really focused more on the processes, not the end product, and procedures, and it can often be linked to empowering people and bringing about greater democracy. And so when thinking about who considers themselves a designer, it's an interesting question. But I would definitely put out there that we're all designers out there, even if it's only every day when we're going to get dressed. We're going to the closet, we're looking at the weather, and we have a problem to kind of solve, and we're picking out an outfit that's suitable to that day. And then maybe we're taking off a sweatshirt or putting on sunglasses or a hat, and we're adapting that design. And that's where this kind of design really comes into play, because it's not we design it and it's done. When we create this kind of design, it also becomes that living system that's evaluated and tweaked. And so I'd like to look at a couple different techniques that are being used right now, mostly in the US, but there's a couple that are used abroad, where people are experimenting with this kind of design that's also linked to social change. So first we'll look at City Repair. And City Repair is operating out of Portland, Oregon. And you can zoom into one of their pieces of work. So the founder, Mark Lakeman, is an architect, and he was feeling really disempowered and disgruntled with the architecture movement and decided to really take a trip throughout the world and take a look at a lot of traditional villages and city design, and figured out some different patterns of what he saw that was really working there. And what he saw that was really different from what he saw back in the US was the idea of public space and the commons. And so what he set to do is actually redesign his city. He said, well, wow, we have all these cities, and they're based upon the pattern of the grid. And what about if we just took that pattern of the grid and turned that into common space? And the way that they got this started in Portland was they just had a weekly potluck. And so his whole neighborhood would come to the potluck, and they built a funky little structure out in the backyard that they could sit under with lights and have tea and eat together and discuss some of the issues of the neighborhood. And it was in those meetings that the idea for City Repair really got solidified. And so what they do is they actually design together in a participatory process these intersections. So they put out there what they'd like to see happen. And this one is Share It Square. And they've got some really interesting features on this. They decide on what to paint, a mural, and then they have actually little stops along the way. One of those stops is a 24-hour tea house. And so they have a solar-powered tea house in which neighbors can all participate by putting out and cleaning mugs and replenishing the tea. And it's all run on a solar panel that heats up the water, provides the electricity. And so they have a 24-hour spot where anybody can come and have tea. They also created a cob bench that's under a nice living roof structure. And this is all right out there, right on this intersection. And what they found is when they put in this intersection repair, that they started getting all of these other yields. All of these other things started happening that they didn't originally even put into the design. They found that traffic started to slow down. People were distracted by all these colors and started to slow down. They noticed that neighbors started to say hi to each other and started to recognize each other. And then they noticed that people stopped moving away so quickly, and they became really rooted in that place. And so in this case, just taking that design about saying, okay, neighborhood, what do we want here in our neighborhood? They actually made it happen. They created this new reality that had all these other side benefits. And the way that they do this is really smart. It's part of their social design, because that's a component to anything we're doing. It might be a physical design, but there's a whole social layer. How does it get installed? Who maintains it? Where's the money coming from? And they crafted a way to do this. And so what they do is they hold a conference every year. It's called the Village Building Convergence. And people come from all over who want to learn how to do this. And they actually have a week-long series of talks and natural building, and they get to create and maintain these intersections. So now what started out is just a conversation that neighbors were having, just by getting people together in that common space, resulted in all of this. The other great thing that they did is they turned it into a city ordinance. And so now actual intersection repair can legally be done. They have an ordinance. Another great example is the Permablitz. And so the Permablitz, again, is coming out of our friends from Australia, where they were creating all these amazing permaculture designs that were facilitating people getting together, creating more food, cleaning the water, dealing with waste in a responsible way. But there is a problem. It took a lot of energy to get these things going. And oftentimes it was a person, maybe a couple. And so they created what's called a Permablitz, which I say is like, it's a really intense period of design activity where people are taking a design from paper and installing it all together. So another way of calling it is a flash mob, only it's much tastier. So this is a Permablitz that we did in Florence, Mass, and you can see the result of the homeowners. And so we stepped in, we brought in a class of about 20 people, and we spent just about 5 hours with all 20 people. And together, we transformed the landscape in just a mere number of hours. So we turned it from this into this. Wow. And it's really, there's something really powerful when you do this as a group. And so you really get to see what you could never do as a single person, but getting just all those people together in one space creates this thing that nobody could have done on their own. And what started to happen, it's interesting, because whenever I do a Permablitz, I'm like, okay, we're going to do this person's going to do this. But after working together, and I'm sure all of you that are doing build and design with other people, something magical starts to happen. And suddenly, the design of the social design starts to take over, and people are just finding their own little niches and helping out, and there's nobody really directing it. And so this starts to happen after a couple hours of working together, people finding niches and plugging in. And another thing that's getting really popular is this idea of tactical urbanism. And especially in the planning worlds, they actually worked with the city of East Hampton, and they're really interesting. They said, we want tactical urbanism. We want people to come in and do things like chair bombing, parking day, bring your own restaurant, seed balls, and pop-up shops. So it's interesting to see as our economy starts to go down, there's a little bit more room for creativity. And there's actually a lot of progressive planners that are in the positions right now that are really wanting this. So tactical urbanism is just a cute way of saying these small interventions that can start out as really temporary, like we saw in city repair, with just potlucks out of a ramshackle creative structure that they created, into a permanent policy and infrastructure on the city. So we can do 1-day events, 1-hour events, 1-minute events, and I'll talk about a couple of those. The top one is a seed ball demonstration. And so seed balls are this amazing technique that was developed in Japan where you put everything that a seed needs to grow in a ball. So you've got your compost, you've got your clay, and you've got your seeds, and you roll it up and it looks like a little truffle. And what you can do is you can launch it into abandoned lots. You can fill it with wildflowers, and you can have access to these nooks and crannies, and then as soon as it rains, flowers start to germinate and pop up. So that's one example of tactical urbanism. And another that I'm really excited about is called Bring Your Own Restaurant. And so this just took place in Holyoke, Mass. And one of the interesting stories of Holyoke, like so many cities around the US, it's like the Rust Belt in New England, where this was one of the first intentionally designed cities in the US. It was known as Paper City, and it was a huge manufacturing place that actually generated a lot of its own power via a waterfall, canals, and water turbines. But as soon as the industry left, we see a lot of these abandoned mill buildings. And we also see that there's not a whole lot of things going on after about 4 p.m. in Holyoke. You know, they turn off, my friends and I joke, they turn off the stop signs, or the traffic lights go off at a certain hour, and they're just kind of blinking because there's not a whole lot going on. And so this was a creative way of using that tactical urbanism to put into place what we'd like to see happen. And so this is Bring Your Own Restaurant. You can see that we're right along the canal. And all that happens is a group puts out the word. We're going to meet at 7 p.m. at the corner of Dwight and Canal. And that's it. Bring your own table, bring your own dish to share, bring some candles, a tablecloth, some flowers, and we're going to actually make our own restaurant. And so it's a really awesome way where at 7 o'clock you go down there, all of a sudden people start coming out of the woodwork with their tables and tablecloths. And they laid out this beautiful whole feast of really delicious food. And so in that moment, you know, we had created that restaurant with waterfront access. And so it's a way to kind of suggest and point at what could be possible, you know, what could be possible in the city, and that at some point it can lead to lasting change. But there's some real power in that pop-upness that comes with the spontaneity. And I'd like to look at another case study of Occupy Wall Street. And Occupy Wall Street is an amazing, prolific event that really started by about 12 or so people gathering in a park and deciding to occupy it. And so what turned out from one small park in New York City actually spread to continents all over the world. My brother was in a small town in France, and they had their own little tiny Occupy. So it was springing up in all these different places. And one of the interesting points about Occupy is that they were reclaiming this public space. And so in Zuccotti Park, a place where people kind of just zipped through, they were recreating that piazza, that place that we saw in city repair, that public place for people to gather. And all of a sudden, they had food. 3 meals a day were served out of that park for thousands of people, all for free and with donations. They had a pop-up library where they had hundreds of books that were donated and cataloged and now still exist. They had pop-up barbershops where people were getting haircuts. We did a free barter market where people would come and exchange goods. And so what was created in the park, aside from just a protest, was an actual vision of what was possible and what people would like to see. And so we participated in Occupy. And I just want to show a short clip of a video. We answered a call that was put out there to design a gray water system that would treat the soapy gray water. And the way that we did this was with the participation of the people in the park. And so they were involved in the installation and tweaking of the gray water system because they were the ones that were washing the dishes, and they were the ones that were needing to live with this.
You ever measure our success, our quality of life.
Permaculture is great in that it's also scaleless. This is a small permaculture system that is sort of sized for this room. But this is also happening on a large scale within the New York harbor estuaries. They're rebuilding oyster beds, they're planting eelgrass, they're doing this filtering 1,000 more tons of water.
And I would say this is proof, like we're doing it. It's already happening. It's not this idea of something that's happening in the future. We're moving. This is an alternative to capitalism in this occupation. Like there's free food. Everybody gets to eat. People are taking care of one another. There's shelter. And so there's communication. Like anybody's empowered to stand up and communicate. So it's already, this is proof that it's already happening. So the first part of the process is the biofilter. And that is a 50-gallon drum filled with wood chips. And what the biofilter does is after they're done washing the dishes, all of the food scraps and oils and soapy water gets poured into the biofilter. And that separates the food chunks and oils, which is just excess nutrients, from the actual soapy gray water. And so then the soapy gray water continues down through 2 chambers that are planted with water-loving plants. And so the water-loving plants take up all those nutrients, and that's food for them to grow. And so we're really replicating patterns in nature. So this is mimicking a wetland, what a wetland's doing, because nature's systems are really resilient and diverse. And so we can learn from that and then apply those principles, both socially as well as ecologically, to really have the steps and process to recreate a new world. Because we don't want to just emulate the old patterns of the privilege and power that we see in this current system to the next one. We want to make sure that everybody has access to clean water, clean soil, clean food, and it's not just for people that can afford it. That's why permaculture design is so important, because it's looking at that people care part as well as the earth care, and then the economic system, so it's looking at all 3.
Living in New York City and being here at Wall Street for the last couple of weeks, really wanted to work with people and to implement something that is experimental, that is actually making the space better, that we're actually changing the space not just by occupying it, but we're looking around at the environment, looking at the trees and at the vegetation. There was a request for a gray water system, and then Lisa saw the sessions coming down and said, let's do it. And that was just planning over one night, over the train. I have this, we have this. We had a friend who happened to I ran into here, who had the tubs already planted. And so in a day and a half, I get it set up.
This is all about participation and just not watching it anymore, but just making that shift of like turning into a producer and really taking an active part in building the world that we want to see, because that's what it's going to take. The change is going to come from all of us. Getting off of that couch or off of the computer, like getting out here, interacting with people. It's just really magical. Like things are just really starting to come together.
Take risks and try things out and experiment. I mean, we do this without any real plan, and this is free, and it's hard, and we have these sort of friends became this community to make this happen. Take a risk, take a day off of work, try something out.
All right. So that's just a glimpse as what was created in those moments at Occupy Wall Street. And it definitely, if any of you were down there at the park, there was something electric in the air. Change was really in the air, and you got the sense that things are really shifting. And really to be able to embody that in the park was a really special thing. We also had rock stars coming, playing free concerts every night. Cornell West came and spoke. So it was like a pretty awesome, vibrant public park that I would like to see happening. So Occupy Wall Street is great, and that was an awesome interruption of business as usual. But I kind of liken Occupy Wall Street to a forest fire. Maybe it creates a disturbance. But what do we actually want to see put in its place, and what are some ways that we can look towards design as a way to shape and shift that? So this is a great project. It's called Participatory Budgeting. It came out of Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989. And it's now spread to many countries all over the world. And it's finally come to the US. It started in Chicago. It's now spread over to New York City. And currently it's involving 20,000 people, 91 projects, and $16.7 million. So what is participatory budgeting, you might ask? You can kind of see that slide. It's where people get to come together and propose what they'd like to see their tax dollars go towards. And so you follow a process where you hold neighborhood assemblies. And so the neighborhood is identifying needs and problems, and they select delegates that are going to represent them through this process. And so the delegates get together and they craft some design proposals about what they'd like to see, specific projects, whether that's a local compost collection or an edible schoolyard, or even just replacing some sidewalks. And so they get to develop those proposals, and then they take it to these larger neighborhood assemblies. So it could, if you can imagine that we're all a neighborhood, and we're coming together in this assembly, and we're getting feedback, where I'm proposing a couple projects, and you're saying, well, yeah, that's great, but what about this? Have you thought about that? And engaging that participatory design process. And then once the proposals get hashed out, it actually goes to a community vote. And I happened to be in Brooklyn one day when they were taking this vote, and it was amazing. You just walk into the representative's office, and you took a ballot. And on the ballot, it had, instead of just checking the box of who you want your rep to be, it actually had concrete projects that you could vote for. And so you get to cast your vote in March, and then you get some projects are selected based on popularity, and then you get to start to implement and monitor the project. And the amazing thing about this is this doesn't happen just in 1 year. This is a continual project. And so it gets funded year after year after year. And we can see that what started in 4 boroughs in New York City has now spread to 7 boroughs. What started in just Chicago is now Chicago, New York, and San Francisco, and some other cities. So in the few years that it's been around, it's had some exponential growth. And it's really just putting the power back into the hands directly into the people that live there, and they can speak directly to what they'd like to see happen. And this is an amazing opportunity, especially as designers, where we can actually have some of our projects funded, where we can actually go for funding and have a great source of funding that's not dependent on grants, but that's actually depending upon your ability to be a good community leader and organizer and really reach out. And so we can see that this is the 4 districts that they did it in 2011 to 12. They had $6 million to spend. So we're not talking about little bits of money. We're actually talking about quite a lot of money when you think about it. So just thinking about what do we want? What do we want to see out there? And how can we look to the process of designing what we want as important as the product that we're putting out there? And how do we actually view ourselves as interconnected, as part of nature? And how do we see nature not as just this sterile thing that we either have to control and manage or protect, but how do we see nature as evolving, as alive? And how do we interact with that and really shape the world we want to see? And how can we do things, looking at things like permablitzes, gathering our community together to put in things like year-round bioshelter. This is at Jonathan Bates' house, where they're actually doing a passive greenhouse that's just heated by the sun, that's producing things like avocados year-round. How do we actually get those things in place and educate the community in the process of doing the workshops? How do we actually use social media, which is what was so effective about the Occupy movement, is their ability to craft memes and really use things like Facebook and Twitter to really get the message out there. This is an infographic that we created looking at the spread of plants, where we have an interactive map, where we did a build-your-own perennial polyculture day, where people got to come and select fruit trees and shrubs and herbs, and then they filled out information. We plotted them on the map so we could start to see the spread of these projects and who was doing them, and how do we use media to really make that visible, all these changes that we're experiencing every day. And how do we open up, just like this lecture here tonight, how do we open up those visions to the public? And this is from a permaculture design class at UMass, where we did our final presentation. We had it in a public building in downtown Northampton, and we put the call out and got standing room only crowd to really hear the visions of what people would like to see, the visions that are about healing and restorative ecologies. Great. So really thinking about how we can use design intentionally to craft the world we'd like to see. Thanks. And great. And I brought a prop. This is what we used at Occupy Wall Street when we did our seed ball demo. We had seed balls for people to take, and they also got to take a card on how to make your own seed balls. So if you want to engage in tactical urbanism, I've got the recipe right here. My contact info is on the back if you want to get in touch. And so those are available for people. And if there's any questions, we have some time for questions as well.
Are there books that you know of that are nice and simple, and if a person wanted to try to start doing this, what would you recommend?
Yeah.
Resources, either just online or books or...
Yeah. City Repair has a really amazing book. It's called the Placemaking Guidebook, cityrepair.org. And so they walk you step by step through the process that they use to redesign the intersections. So that's an amazing resource. There's also the Project for Public Places in New York City, and that's another resource that you can look to. And in terms of, one of the best things is just to get your hands dirty, and if you have a project, think about ways that you can engage the public around you to participate in that. So those are a couple resources.
You should write a book.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, yeah.
And you should go all over giving lectures other than just here. You should start a business.
Yeah, well, I do have a business, so you can bring me out to you if you'd like. Thank you.
Some of us might be interested if you know anything about projects people are working on, maybe Montpelier, Burlington, or other.
Yeah, so there's an amazing network in Montpelier. There's the village. They hold their own village building convergence, which happens, I think, at the end of June, I want to say. And there's a graduate of the permaculture program here that's really integral in organizing that. And you can talk to myself or Kate to get hooked up with them. They actually installed part of an edible forest garden on the State House lawn in Montpelier. So they installed an edible landscape as part of one of their activities in the village building convergence. So there's a good network here. In the back?
What is chair bombing?
Chair bombing, I know, that's an interesting one. So it's really cool. There's a great video online where, in one incident, where they went dumpster diving, they pulled out a lot of pallets, shipping pallets, and they turned them into chairs. And so this was in New York City, where they just set them out someplace where there should be a bench. So it's called chair bombing, where you can drag these chairs or make your own chairs and set them out. And when they made that in New York City and set it out, people were so drawn to it and became a vibrant space. And the business started putting out their own benches. So that's chair bombing.
I'm just curious about what you find are to be effective techniques for outreach, because I love the idea of seed bombing.
Yeah.
But if you reach out in New York, I can guarantee you'll get people from downtown Manhattan, Williamsburg, but not the South Bronx, where there's a food desert that really needs to be implemented somehow.
Yeah, it's an interesting question of how to properly do outreach. And I mean, one thing is just thinking about relationships, like how do we actually build trusting relationships with people in our communities? How do we build up that trust? And so, there's all different ways of doing that. There's things online like Meetup, but those maybe certain reach only a part of the population. But just going out there and maybe finding those spots that are existing community centers, because they're already out there. And maybe it doesn't look like a public park, but maybe there's a certain stoop or bench or area where people are hanging out and interacting with folks. Yeah, so it's a long question, and we can talk about it more later.
I'm interested in hearing more about your experience with Occupy Wall Street in Vermont, because we were in another state outside a large city, and Occupy Wall Street came and they did all the things you showed, they shared books, they shared food, and then all of a sudden, and the police were nice, allowed them to do this, and then they left.
Yeah.
And the taxpayer was left with cleaning up, sanitation department, cleaning up the park, and the park was totally ruined, the grass was all gone, and there's now a public expense, and we don't see anything resulting from it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. A couple things to say about that. One result of it is if you listen to Obama talking shortly after Occupy movement, he started to reframe the way that he was talking about wealth. And so he actually used the words inequality, which for a president to use the word inequality is a powerful shift in vocabulary. So that's just a shift in vocabulary, but it actually changed the whole international dialogue about what was happening within the U.S. and our economic system. I wasn't here for Vermont, so I can't speak directly to that experience in the park, but at least in New York City, there was a whole sanitation committee that was created that dealt with trash. We had compost. We were biking out compost to the community gardens in order to be churned into compost and then grow vegetables and flowers out of it. So that was a highly organized...
In New York City?
Yeah.
You're not referring to Manhattan?
In Manhattan, right in Zuccotti Park.
The gardens in Manhattan?
There was community gardens.
There's a compost right near, I don't know, near one of the parks. Not Central Park, but I saw it and I was like, oh.
So it was actually highly organized, and pretty high functioning. Yeah, so there's that way of looking at it. And then I think most importantly, it was changing the conversation, deciding on what work needed to be done. And this was done in huge assemblies like this, where you actually had people deciding in assemblies and by consensus. And they did this great thing, which was called the, it was called the mic, where you would repeat back. Since the police said you can't have any amplification, they had to be creative. And so they said every time somebody would say something, it would get repeated back by the whole crowd. So let's try that just for a minute, just to feel the kind of the power of that. So I'll say something and then you all repeat it back to me, okay? Okay. This is the sound.
This is the sound
of the human mic.
Of the human mic.
How does it feel to talk?
How does it feel to talk?
Instead of being talked at.
Instead of being talked at.
Great, so that always gives me chills. And they had great speakers like Naomi Klein came down to the park, and she did her whole speech like that. And so it really spoke to, I think, potential, if anything. And we can look, even in nature, there's the idea of the spring ephemeral, where we get ramps here, and along the Winooski, we get ramps, or we get fiddleheads, and they're only there for a moment, and then they kind of go away. But there's this whole underground network that's still alive, like mushrooms almost, the mycelium in the soil. And where do we see this again? If you fast forward from Occupy Wall Street to Occupy Sandy, we see the storm of Sandy really devastating New York City. And what happened is the Occupy movement had built this web of organizing. They knew how to live, with no electricity hardly at all. They knew how to get food donations. They knew how to have sanitation systems set up. They knew how to wash dishes and all that. So you see the Occupy Wall Street transforming into Occupy Sandy. And they were approached by FEMA and a lot of the aid organizations and said, wow, how do you all, they were like out impressing all of the organizations because they really had built those trust and relationships and ties. And so they were one of the first lines of defense after the storm because they had built that. So it's almost like it might not be visible at all, but it's that mycelial web that's there that's waiting for an opportunity to pop up and help out. And it really speaks to potential of what we can do when we're operating with that new paradigm. Great. All right. Thank you.